Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar. My name is Adam, Content Marketing Specialist with Schein, and I'll be your moderator. Please note that there will be no live Q&A following today's presentation. If you have additional questions, please reach out via the email noted on your screen. This webinar is presented by Henry Schein Dental Business Institute, and no CE credits are being offered for viewing this presentation. Our speaker today is Dr. Thomas Snyder. Dr. Snyder is the Senior Director with Henry Schein Professional Practice Transitions. Thank you, Dr. Snyder, for being here today. We look forward to your presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Adam, thank you for the kind introduction. I'm happy that you're here to join me talking about a very important topic, pandemic impact on practice values and transition planning. I've got a lot of information, lots of facts. That's how I like to lecture. So here we go. So tonight we have lots to cover. And one of the first objectives is to discuss the pandemic's impact on practice values, both in the short and the long term. We're going to review the common valuation methods that we use. We're going to discuss factors affecting a dental practice's value. We're also going to discuss why we think it's important to establish a baseline practice valuation. Then we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the importance of transition planning and developing an emergency exit strategy. So there's lots of reasons why someone wants their practice valued. Obviously, for those of you who are thinking of a short or long-term practice transition or sale, that's why you want to know what your value is worth. If you're in a partnership or you're an associate wanting to buy in, you'll want a valuation either buying in or buying out your partner. We'll discuss the emergency exit strategy rationale. For those of you who work with a financial planner or doing some estate planning, having a properly prepared valuation is a must. For those of you who are thinking of a transition where it may not be a sale, you might be merging in with someone, so valuing your practice is also important. And unfortunately, for those who may be going through a matrimonial divorce or partnership divorce, there are specialized valuations for that purpose, as well as there are for personal goodwill. We'll talk a little bit about goodwill later on this evening. And finally, if you're a C Corp and want to convert to an S Corp, so there's some technical reasons for it, but you can see there's lots of reasons why practice valuations are important. So let's talk about pre-COVID. Where were we in practice valuation landscape? Well, as many of you know, it's been a seller's market for some time. Practice values were at their peak over the last few years. And one of the contributing factors was the fact that there are more purchasers than sellers. And this, we'll see some data in a minute to support this statistic that the average retirement age is now 69.4 years old. It's been gradually increasing over the years. We're also seeing a shift, however, now relating to the annual number of retirees versus dental graduates. And also, the DSOs were purchasing practice at premiums in certain markets. So we had supply and demand, and competitiveness among DSOs were contributing factors to why practice values were so high in so many markets of the country. Now let's take a look at our dental profession. As you can see, we've got a fairly older group of people. And let's pay particular attention to the last bar on the left, 65 plus. There are approximately 32,000 dentists who are in that age category, and another 44,000 in the ages between 55 or 64. So one could argue, based on your financial position, that many of you are or have been thinking about a transition plan. And from some of the data that I'll share with you this evening, you're going to find that the older age group are ones that are rethinking their futures, both immediate and short term. So that's an important statistic. On the far right, you'll see that we have slightly more dentists under the age of 35 than over the age of 65. So you can see we have a lot of folks that are in that transition category, so to speak. Now, here's an interesting slide. We've been using this on seminars over the years to kind of track the number of graduates and retirees. And you'll see back in 2010, we had a little less than 5,000 dental graduates, but only about 1,200 to 1,300 retirees. Now, why was that so? Well, we had the Great Recession. And the Great Recession changed a lot of plans for many, many practitioners, to the extent that they put off their retirement for a number of years. That's why the retirement age has been growing. You'll notice here in 2018, though, there's a catch-up going on right now where we're about 4,800 doctors retiring. But you'll also know that the number of dental graduates has increased to about 62 to 6,300. Now, I think with what we're going to be talking about tonight, I think you'll readily agree that if I were to create a slide for 2020 and 2021, I have a strong suspicion that that dark blue bar will be in excess of the lighter blue bar. What does that mean? That means we're going to reach the crossover point, which many of us in our profession thought was going to happen in the transition world, that is, years ago. But because of the Great Recession, that had a tremendous impact, as well as the pandemic, we think will have a tremendous impact on the number of doctors retiring. So back in the day, what were dental practices worth? Well, the majority of dental practices around the country, and this includes specialty practices, varied anywhere between 60 to 85% of prior year's gross receipts. Okay, so obviously you'll see a wide variation. And why is that so? Well, we have a big country. And what many of you probably are aware of, that practice values vary based on where you are practicing. It's based on population density, number of dentists, and a lot of other factors. But that's why, just before the end of the year, practices in Northern Virginia were selling for 90% of last year's gross. For example, down in Charleston, South Carolina, 80 to 85%. Washington, D.C., 85%. Southern California, close to 100%. Throughout the country, we had tremendous variations. You maybe go up into the New England states, perhaps in Maine, you might see 60 to 65%. So there's really no standard value. It's a range based on a lot of factors, some of which we're going to cover tonight. Now, all of a sudden, things are going along great, right? And now we hit the brick wall, the pandemic. And what has that done to our dental economy? It's still a work in progress, and we're going to cover as much current data as we have. So for those of you who recall the Great Recession, remember, it was not an abrupt shock to our profession. Dental offices remained open. They experienced slower growth, lower revenue and net profit over a prolonged period of time. And the recovery in our dental economy significantly lagged the recovery in the U.S. economy. And not until 2015, almost 7 years after the Great Recession began, did dental spending begin to grow at pre-recession levels, but unfortunately never caught up to those levels, to the extent that it was only 80 to 85% of projected dental spending. And what we don't know yet is how much of an impact the pandemic will have on some of these numbers. So to that extent, the American Dental Association's Health Policy Institute, a great research arm of the association, began a tracking survey. And we're going to give you some of those statistics because they're rather revealing. But as of April 6th, just a little over a month ago, 79.5% of all the respondents were closed, but seeing only emergency patients only. As of the same date, 17.6% of the respondents in that same survey were completely closed. So many of you saw your emergency patients, but that was it. And you were restricted too by government rules and regulations as well, either federal and or state. And this is an interesting, in the Wall Street Journal the other week, April was the worst month for dentistry. They looked at healthcare loss across all medical and dental, and there were about 1.5 million jobs lost in April, but dentistry was number one. Unfortunately, 500,000 positions were lost. So pretty devastating. And more importantly, our patients have been severely impacted with a record loss of 20.5 million jobs, let alone in April. I'm not going to get into too many numbers, but suffice it to say, the American Dental Association's Health Policy Institute is doing some modeling to try to figure out what the impact could be on our dental economy. So they looked at 4 different scenarios. The first scenario states that by May 2021, the U.S. economy will fully recover, and dental spending will recover to 80% of the pre-pandemic levels by that same date. Scenario 2, we again look at the U.S. economy fully recovering by May 2021. Dental spending will fully recover to pre-pandemic levels by the same date. Scenario 3, the U.S. economy fully recovers by 2021, certainly a more aggressive position. Dental spending recovers to 80% of its pre-pandemic. And finally, both the U.S. economy and dental spending recover full bore by 2021. And as the Health Policy Institute will correctly state, this is just the early stage. Remember how many variations there were on projections of disease and incidence and death with the coronavirus? Well, this is the same kind of thing that's going on right now. Based on this data, they looked at scenarios for a 2-year period. In 2020, they're modeling in a reduction in dental spending between 58.2% to a high of 66.5%. That's a reduction. And I think it's certainly understandable when you see how many dental offices have been closed and how many are still working and just reopening. So it's devastating impact on our profession. 2021, however, looks a little bit better. And they're varying statistics between a 32.3% reduction to a full recovery. So obviously, 2020 is the toughest year, and it's going to be the toughest year, in our opinion, for practice values as well. It makes sense, doesn't it? So how quickly will we rebound? Well, the one thing that's kind of unique about this study is that they selected a number of dentists to participate. And it is a study that's done every 2 weeks. Right now, they're surveying approximately 6,700 dentists nationally every 2 weeks. And what I'm going to share with you, the most recent survey data that was taken as of May 4th. So let's look at some of the points, and they're pretty interesting. Number one, 30% of practices nationally were open last week. That's the week of May 4th for elective procedures, as compared to 3% 2 weeks prior. So that's a pretty dramatic increase in a 2-week period. They're also measuring by age. We're looking at not only by age group, they're also looking at solo practices and small groups and large groups. So they're tracking different kinds of data. So from this data, they found that younger dentists are more likely to have opened for elective procedures last week. Patient volume, which is not surprising, was on average 18% of normal for open practices, because many practices who opened on a limited basis to kind of ramp up getting things ready for PPE, all their protocols that needed to be done for patient and staff and doctor protection. Larger groups are seeing slightly bigger bounce backs. Solo practitioners trail behind. And I think some of the other data that's in this study shows that solo practitioners are the ones that are struggling more than any group. Also, interesting statistic that of the respondents, 33% said they had their entire staff back and they were paying them full compensation. I think part of that was due to the influx of PPP money. Additionally, about 36% were partially paying staff, so they didn't have the full staff back, but it shows a pretty good employment picture, almost 70%. That to me is a big positive. This is a rather sobering statistic, and one which may have some implications for doctors thinking about where they want to be in the next couple of years as a non-owner dentist. 56% of employee dentists and independent contractors were laid off, and 57% of those were on unemployment. That's pretty staggering. This is not a surprise. The N95 masks and gowns are particularly in short supply. And they also measured a concern. They use a scale of 1 to 5, asking doctors, were they concerned about themselves, patients, and staff, and to what degree about transmission of COVID? And the doctors came in just at about 2.8, 2.9, which they considered a moderate concern. So they also found that doctors in the older age group had much more concern. And I think that's fairly obvious. And what we're seeing in our business, because we also, in addition to valuing dental practices, we are practice brokers. We're getting lots of calls from doctors, typically doctors in their mid to late 60s, early 70s, who are having a change of heart for a whole bunch of reasons. So I think these are confirming. But I think the bottom line is that things are starting to happen. Now, next week, there will be another report from the HPI group, and I'll be interested to hear how things are moving now that we have two more weeks into the reopening phase. So, for those of you who were hoping I was going to tell you what percentage reduction there will be in practice values, I hate to disappoint you, but I don't have an answer. And the reason I don't have an answer is we're still early on. We really don't know how quickly we're going to recover. We really don't know how our patients are going to respond to come back to us. We really don't know how all the guidelines, which some in cases state by state, will have an impact on our clinical production. I have no crystal ball, so I can only tell you what we think may be the case and give you some guidance. We know it's going to be a tough year for valuing practices. So no revenue for several months, and then a gradual revenue increase as your practices reopen. If you remember, many of you had great months in January and February. Then everything started to fall apart March, April, and now here we are, May, in a reopening month. So clearly, the first half of 2020 is not going to look like, hopefully, the second half of 2020. And one thing I think we all should realize, unlike people who own a restaurant, as a good example in the food services industry, a meal lost is a meal probably not regained. A recare appointment lost is a recare appointment scheduled later. So what we see in the dental world is that we're having not a permanent revenue loss, but a deferral to a later period, which means we may have some really strong months in the second half of 2020 from a revenue and collection point of view. So it's hard to say yet. We're still early on, but we're going to be looking at trends pretty heavily. Many of us are concerned, and we all are, about major spikes occurring. With the reopening, we're seeing some spikes in certain states. Will that lead to more closures? Will the practices have to be closed again? Or worse yet, will the virus come back with vengeance in fall and winter? So we're still in a lot of risk area, but it's an ongoing story. One of the things that we're hearing from those in the corporate world, that most corporate buyers will be on the sidelines for the rest of 2020, because just like the solo practitioner, they had to close. Even though they were seeing patients, they have to ramp up again. And I think due to the uncertainty of how they're going to value a business that they want to buy, I think many of them just want to, what they call, protect their balance sheet. So we don't think there's going to be a lot of action in the corporate world for practices being sold to them, with the exception of those that were under letter of intent or in a due diligence phase when this event occurred. What we think may happen, again, only conjecture, again, crystal balling, that based on the success in Q3 and Q4 of 2020, the values may begin to return to pre-COVID levels or at slightly lower values in certain parts of the country, meaning it's conceivable that some of the stronger practices, when we look at them towards the end of 2020 and do a look back, with the exception of what happened for those closure months, they're kind of back to where they were. And as valuators, we're going to have to consider that stoppage of practice in our valuation calculations. We don't think a doctor should be penalized for closing 2 weeks, because if that practice can rebound and come back close to where they were before pre-COVID, that's a good sign for a fair value to be rendered. Now, of course, if the vaccine becomes available in 2021 and the economy really rebounds, as some people are predicting, we return to pre-COVID levels, private sale values should go back to where they were or close to it. However, what we're learning is that many of the corporate groups will probably use lower multiples for their acquisitions, meaning lower values. And one of the reasons that's so is many of the corporate groups, and we'll talk about EBITDA a little bit later this evening, they use what's called a TTM, a trailing 12-month look. So obviously, the closure time is going to be in that trailing 12 months. So I think the days of the real premiums paid for by those groups may not be what's going to be in the foreseeable future, maybe in a few years, but not short term. So let's talk about establishing a baseline value. Why is it so important? Well, we think you should know what we think your market value was when things were normal. And it's important as we talk about transition planning to know what a market value is of your business when you were really doing well and things were normal. It's important. In addition, it's important to establish a practice value for emergency exit strategy purposes. Uh, and those of you who are looking at a short-term transition, meaning tomorrow or through the end of this year, having that market value will be something we can use as a negotiating tool with a buyer, particularly if you open up and show rebound and start to look like you did prior to the event occurring. So again, we think that's important. And so if you're going to value a practice now, clearly it's anyone's guess. It's almost to the extent of negotiating between a buyer and a seller. That's why we are not doing any practice valuations right now. We're only doing valuations through 12/31/2019. It doesn't mean we're not going to do valuations later this year, but it's way too soon to tell because things are such a dynamic state. So when we value a practice according to its market value. And that's the price that the practice assets are likely to bring as a going concern in a particular geographic area. Now, practice values have components: intangible assets and tangible assets. We find in most practices, whether it's a specialty practice or a general practice, on average, again, these are averages, the mix between intangibles and tangibles is 75 intangible, tangible 25. Now, if you have a lot of new equipment and technology, it could be 70/30 or 65/35, but that's generally it. And if you look at why values are so high, equipment is equipment, but it's the goodwill, the intangible assets that really make a difference. Now, tangible assets, obviously pretty straightforward: your dental business equipment, technology, instruments and supplies, and leasehold improvements. Now, the intangible assets, most of it's goodwill, restrictive covenant to a certain degree, patient list, and specialty or multiple locations, it could be the phone number. So let's talk a little bit about common valuation approaches. And the valuation approaches we use are those that are required by the American Academy of Certified Valuation Analysts. And so they want you to apply approaches. Now, an approach can use different valuation methods. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we do it. We use three approaches. We prepare a 30 to 35 page document. It's pretty detailed, a little bit technical, but what we're trying to do when we value your practice is we're looking at your dental practice through three different lenses. And we're going to take the average of the three to figure out what we feel your market value is. So the first approach is called the market approach. And for that, we use a method called the guideline transaction method. And not to get too technical, but just to give you an idea, what that really is, it's more of a comparative sales methodology, meaning we're going to look at databases. The two common databases that most valuators use in dentistry are the Goodwill Registry and Pratt's Stats. So we're going to look at comparative sales. We're going to look at different parts of the country, either by state or portions of the state, depending on the size of the data. So it's really a comparative analysis. And that's just to give you a look at one of the pages from our report. As you can see, we look at all the revenue data. We then look at, for this case, the region, which was New England, and then we drill down on the third graph to Massachusetts, where this valuation was done. So we apply different looks to come up with a number. Now, the next approach is the one that's most commonly used by financial people, And actually, it's really used by the DSOs and corporate groups, and that's called the income approach. In the income approach, the first thing we do is we normalize certain expenses, because if certain expenses are out of range, we adjust them to what ranges they should be in. For example, we'll look at dental supplies, office expenses, rent, professional fees, building repairs, and maintenance. So, for example, if I see a 5% ratio for office expense, I'll probably use anywhere between 1.5 to 2%, and I will adjust the expense by 3%. The same thing would go with dental supplies. In rent, for example, let's assume that you own the building, but you don't charge yourself a rent. Well, we're going to impute a rent because you're really showing higher profit because you paid no rent. But from an evaluator's perspective, we have to impute that rent, so we normalize it. We also, in the income approach, are really looking at what's the true earnings stream. So there are other expenses that have to be considered, and they're called discretionary expenses: continuing education, travel, dues subscriptions, certain insurances, owners' pension contributions, and family members' comp. So we'll adjust those back, which will show what? A higher earnings stream, because that's what we're going to base the valuation on. Again, this is an excerpt from our report. It basically shows the adjustments that are made without getting into any detail, because we really don't need to. You'll see a lot of lines there, and all those lines are adjustments to expense for the doctor. So what happens is when we get that earnings, sustainable earnings, we're going to look at the value of a dental practice based on the present value of its future economic benefits. And what we want to do is determine the earnings available for distribution to owners. And so what are the sustainable earnings before interest and taxes are paid? So when we use this particular method, we're going to look at numerous risk factors and then arrive at a return on the equity that will determine a capitalization or cap rate. And all you really need to know is if the cap rate is higher, your value will be lower. If the cap rate is lower, your value will be higher. So a lower cap rate implies what? Less risk. So it's the old story. How much are you willing to risk to buy an income stream? Is it $1.2 million? Is it $1.5 million? Is it 500,000? Whatever the number is, it's really, that's what we're trying to do to come up with in a cap method. The asset approach, the third method here, is basically we're going to look at what the market value of the assets are. That could be the technology and equipment. We use a particular ratio for inventory, and then we abstract the goodwill registry again and get a goodwill number. So we come up with a value. So here's how the math works. We take the guideline transaction method plus the cap earnings method plus the asset method, and we come in to a final value for your business. Now, DSOs and corporates use a different approach. They usually don't use the three methods I just presented. They use a variation of the income approach, and they're going to measure your business on your EBITDA. And what is that? EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So how does it work? Well, we look at historical revenue. We then normalize the overhead. So the evaluator for a corporate purchase will normalize overhead, just kind of how we did it. But remember, when you normalize something, there aren't necessarily standards. So one corporate entity may normalize something one way versus one another way. The same thing happens in the lending world. When we work with banks, when we sell a practice, they do their own calculations, and sometimes they disagree with the valuation normalization adjustments we made. They do it differently. So that's relatively subjective based on the valuator. Okay. Then what they next do is impute a reasonable doctor compensation. And that's usually a percentage of receipts with or without hygiene adjustment based on whether it's a general practice or a certain specialty. So that those numbers can vary anywhere from 28 to 30, 33, 34%. Again, each company does it differently. So there's some subjectivity there, right? So what we come up with when we do these calculations is EBITDA. we subtract the normalized overhead from practice revenue, we add the doctor comp, and that gives us the EBITDA calculation. What are the key takeaways about EBITDA? Well, this is all pre-pandemic. For solo general practices, it varied between 3 to 4 times EBITDA. On occasion, with an exceptional practice that was highly profitable and had a lot of other really good factors, we may push it to 5, but usually 3 to 4 seem to be the norm. For multiple practice roll-ups, by that I mean a corporate buying of 5, 6, 7, 8 practices, the EBITDA ratio would be between 8 or 12 or even more, depending on the particular practices being acquired. And what did that really mean? It meant, comparatively speaking, between 75 to 100% ratio of last year's gross receipts to the value determined. So we're just going to cover for a minute or two some of the points that are important when we value practices. Well, first of all, we all know this is one of the driving factors is the area demographics. Where are you located? Obviously, small town and rural areas will be at a lower value than urban and suburban, all because of population density and doctor availability. We'll look at the industries in the area. Are they diversified, or is it a one industry economy? Is there a lot of recent or planned commercial development going on? And also, are there a lot of new housing starts? So that's a real big driver. Another big driver is overhead, right? Because it's all about profit, all about cash flow, earnings. So if we look at earnings at a 50% level versus 70% level, obviously one would argue that the 70% value will be lower than the 50% overhead practice, correct? And when we see an office with 70% overhead, we typically see that it has high staff costs. Now, those high staff costs do not imply that the doctor is mismanaging his business. It's just that he or she has a very loyal, long-term staff that has lots of fringe benefits for their retention. So that's what we usually see. Also, in urban areas where occupancy costs can be 9, 10, 11, 12%, that drives overhead as well. But again, that does have an impact on value. Your facility also is important because obviously if someone's going to buy your business, they want to buy something that's they can take over day one, and hopefully they don't have to make an investment. Because if they have to make an investment in new equipment, maybe the price that you wanted for your business and what you're going to get are two different things because they have to borrow more money to improve the facility. So we look at number of treatment rooms. Is there room for expansion? What's the age and condition of dental equipment, business and reception area? And is there technology and how much and how current? If you're a tenant, is your lease renewable? If it's not, that's a real big problem. And more importantly, what's the length of the lease? Typically, most banks require that your lease term should be the same as the bank financing term. If it's 7 years or 10 years, that's what they want to see. Economic variables have some impact on value, whether it's fee for service or it's PPO, indemnity plans, or Medicaid. So again, we look at these kinds of mixes in our calculations. Finally, another big factor that could be a negative for you is having a former associate in your community without a restrictive covenant. So again, we need to know that. So that's kind of where we are with valuations. Again, in summary, I can't tell you exactly what the drop's going to be in 2020, only it's going to be pretty severe, but it may get better as we get later on in the year as we reopen more practices. So let's talk in closing a little bit about transition planning because it is an important topic, and that's one of the first things we do when we work with a doctor. We really want to get to know them. It's important if they're coming to us for advice in charting their future. I've always asked this question: if you could paint a picture of the perfect transition, what would it look like? And if I asked you to jot it down and send me an email, I'd have lots of variations because we're all different. We're at different stages of our career. We're at different stages of our career financially as well. And so it's a highly variable and highly personalized answer that you would give. But one thing we are very strong on when we do our transition planning with our clients is that you should have an exit strategy, an emergency exit strategy, which we'll talk about in a minute, as well as one that is planned and carefully thought out. Now, I grant you that with this pandemic, that's another variant because it's really, really thrown a lot of things up in the air. To put this in perspective, let's talk about it in terms of some key questions that you need to answer. First, how long do you plan on being a practice owner? Well, obviously, for many of you who were looking at retirement later, now it's sooner than later. So many of you, and I've spoken to a number of folks who have changed their minds and that they want to exit, some immediately, and it's because of health reasons. We could go on anecdotally telling you about doctors who've called us and who wanted to basically say, sell my practice, whatever you get, I'm happy with. I'm okay financially. I just can't go back to work because my doctor won't let me. Or I don't want to go back to work because I am afraid because I'm in that age group and risk profile. So we're seeing a lot of that, and it's very valid, and it's really of concern. So the short-term doctors obviously have to expect that they're going to get a lot less for their practice, and that their exit, even though it's not planned as they hope, they just can't expect maximum value, which they would have probably wanted had we talked to them last year. The other consideration, too, is are you planning or do you want to sell it as a going concern? Or are you going to consider a possible merger or another strategy? So those are questions that you need to answer. Another significant point, and this has a lot to do with what you may have left after you sell it, is do you have practice debt and how much is there? So again, these are things that need to be factored in. If you are a tenant, what are you going to do about your lease if you have a lease that's going on for a number of years? Now, some of you may say, well, I was thinking of retiring in maybe 2-3 years, but with all this stuff going on, let's get the practice valued. Let's get everything in order. And if I can get a reasonable value over the next 12 to 18 months, I'm ready to go. And we see a lot of those doctors who are in that mode. So as I said earlier, if you're in the midterm category, chances are you're going to do a lot better financially with value than you would if you're doing it over the next several months. And of course, when you think about the 12 to 18 month time frame, you really could almost get maximum value because if you can get your practice back on track and patients do return and all those kind of good things, and maybe you might find after we do the valuation, when we look at the numbers, we say, well, you know what, maybe you should make some minor enhancements in your facility, maybe buy some small equipment or things of that nature to help enhance your sale. Now, the next big question, once we get through that, is after you sell, do you want to continue practicing? Again, for a number of you, you probably would have answered yes if I presented this webinar in November. But a lot of you are now saying, get me out. I don't want to practice anymore. But for those of you who want to practice or have to practice, the most important criteria, whether you can do that after you sell, is will the patient base be adequate? Is it really is it a doctor and a half practice, or is it a one doctor practice? So I'm the doctor who buys you out. I don't need you anymore because I've got to work 5 days a week because I borrowed a lot of money or I borrowed some money depending on when you bought the practice, right? Plus I've got student debt. I've got to work hard. I don't need you. Or if there are enough patients, will you be compatible with the owner? Is this a person you've known for years, or is it someone that someone found for you to become your successor? So there could be some issues there as well. And more importantly, if you are going to stay, are there going to be any limitations to services? What were you providing before sale? And what does the new doctor want to provide? Are you going to be competing for that service mix? Well, those things have to be decided. So limitations are critical. The question is, do you know what your practice is worth as of 12/31/19? Well, the answer is most of you probably don't because you haven't had a valuation. But as we feel very strongly, we think you should have a valuation done so we can identify any opportunities, any enhancements that we may have, especially if you're going to be in the game for a number of years. It's a very important baseline to have. If those of you who work with a financial planner or a financial advisor, knowing what your practice value is critical. Because one of the other questions we ask is the sale of your dental practice going to be part of your financial plan, or can you sell your practice and not have any worries? Is it more of a legacy issue? So if you say, I need every dollar because I'm not ready to retire, that really makes the planning more challenging and difficult. And it's more of a mountain to climb. Okay. And also, for those of you thinking of selling, one of the purposes of doing a market value is it'll help set a sale price when it is time to sell. Then, of course, we'll talk in a minute about emergency exit strategy, why that's also important. Now, I referenced the financial planner. And so we're very pro, especially if you have a little time to figure out your exit strategy. If you haven't really considered it, you should think about working with a financial planner to help set some goals and targets. And if you have a ways to go, then you've got time to do it. But at least it gives you some organization and comfort of whether or not things will work and whether your retirement goals align with your retirement income needs, because financial planners may say, well, if you need X dollars a year, here's your investment pool. You've got to keep working for a while. You've got to put more away because you either have to reduce your lifestyle requirements or work longer. So that's why financial planners are really, really important to help things out and really be a strong ally. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about emergency exit strategy. What do I mean by that? Well, it simply means that all practitioners should have an emergency exit strategy in case of unforeseen events. And it's important to know what your practice is worth, and it's important for your spouse to know what your current value is worth. And so if you get your practice valued and we know what it's worth, the next thing we recommend is to prepare a letter of instruction. And a letter of instruction is a document which can be given to a group of contact people. Obviously, your spouse, your CPA, your attorney, and yes, your dental rep or FSC should be one of the first to contact because they have a relationship with you. And one of the things that makes it very difficult for us is when something happened, a doctor passes, we need to get on this quickly. We need to help the family and the estate to move that practice. So sometimes the FSC is a big ally there. And so if we had this letter of instruction, we wouldn't have to try to reach people during a very difficult time of life. And now this letter really drives an action plan. Because one of the things that maybe you are or not aware of, and this is based on our experience of over 25 years, that we find that about 30% of practices will sell within 90 days of death because word gets out, particularly in a small town. Only an additional 10% will sell after 90 days. And unfortunately, 60% of practices do not sell at all if the sale is delayed more than 90 days. And you can readily understand why that would happen because staff are leaving, patients are leaving, going to other doctors. Now, we have prepared an interactive PDF called a letter of instruction. And this is a multiple page document, which we're going to make available to you. We'll talk about that in a minute. That will be your guideline to have it completed and give it to all the key people. So if something were to happen to you, an action plan can be developed. So there's a couple of questions. One question in particular I just got that question is, will you factor in my practice closure when you value my practice at the end of 2020? The question is, yes, we will factor it in. What we probably will do is not look at those couple of months of closures and do some financial adjustments. We'll probably look at a run rate of revenue. We'll look at how you're rebounding, but we will do some manipulation to come up with a fair number, because you shouldn't be penalized for the 2 months of closure, which were not your fault. Another doctor said, I own my real estate. If I sell my practice now, should I sell my real estate or should I hold on to it? Well, the answer to that question is it really depends, because that's why you need a financial advisor. For example, if you have a lot of debt on your practice and or your building, and someone wants to buy your building, well, maybe you might want to consider doing that to get out of debt. That's one way of looking at it. Other people may want to hold on to it as an asset, because if it's a multiple tenant asset, they could really get some rental income. I'm sure you'll have some questions, because I covered a lot of ground tonight. And if you do so, you can reach us at www.henryscheinppt.com or ppt@henryschein.com. Or you can call our corporate office in New Jersey at 800-988-5674. And one of our staff will direct you to one of our reps to speak to answer some of your questions. Now, we really talk about the importance of establishing a baseline valuation. And what we're offering our doctors is, if you make a decision to get a baseline value prepared between now and July 31, 2020, we will prepare a complimentary valuation at the end of 2020 as an update. And then we'll give you what we think your practice is worth at the end of 2020. But we'll do the baseline, and the baseline will be done through December 31st, 2019. Also, I want to put a plug in for my next webinar. That'll be next Monday night, not Tuesday, next Monday night, June 1st, thinking about buying or selling a practice during the pandemic recovery. So we're going to be talking to buyers and sellers about some of the issues that we see, some of the issues in bank financing that we see, and more importantly, I'll be sharing with you the most recent data that will be released next Thursday from the ADA's Health Policy Institute, from that survey of 6,700 dentists. So that could be extremely telling. So I will include that in my presentation on June 1st. And finally, I want to thank you all for attending this program tonight. These are very difficult and stressful times. We all feel it. We all have family and friends that may have been impacted by this virus. And all we can do is continue to be positive and work as hard as we can and do the best that we can. Also, want to mention that if you're interested in getting a copy of the letter of instruction, you'll be able to do so by going to our website at henryscheinppt.com/what-if. And you'll be able to download this document and get it prepared, hopefully get a valuation done, and get your emergency exit strategy plan into place. Again, thank you for attending, and I wish you all a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Snyder, for being with us today and presenting on this topic. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. If you have questions for Dr. Snyder, please reach out via the email noted on your screen. As a thank you for attending, you will be receiving today's recording in the coming week via email. Thanks again for attending.